Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
We love our book clubs, but no one wants to do required reading all the time. And so today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones that we get to pick and choose. And so on my list I have In the Dream House by Carmen Machado, Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, and Morning by Allan Jenkins.
And on my list, West with the Night by Beryl Markham, A Drop of Patience by William Melvin Kelley, and The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel.
Keep listening to hear what we thought of them, and maybe we can help you find your next book club pick.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Kate, who wants to go first? Do you have a book that you can't wait to tell me about?
I am quite keen to talk about In the Dream House. Can I start with that? This is one of those books where I kept reading about it online. You know, one of those books where everything you read, people are always absolutely ecstatic. They're raving about a book. I didn't read a bad word about it. And I was very intrigued. But it's not something I would have thought I'd wanted to read about. It is about an abusive relationship between two women. In the Dream House traces the full arc of a harrowing relationship with a charismatic but volatile woman. Struggling to make sense of how what happened to her shaped the person she became, Machado considers her religious adolescence, unpacks the stereotype of lesbianism as safe and utopian, and explores the stigma of openly discussing abuse in queer relationships. It has been quite a good lockdown read because it's written in these short fragments, so just a page or 2 pages or 3, lots and lots and lots of very short chapters. And it begins with an epigraph. If you need this book, it is for you. And then there are a few more, and then it goes into the first chapter, which is Dream House as Overture. I never read prologues. I find them tedious. If what the author has to say is so important, why relegate it to the pretext? What are they trying to hide? And it's just that. You're drawn in from the very beginning to this real sense of kind of intimacy and complicity with the narrator. And then it's quite hard to sum up what unfolds.
Is it a memoir? Is it Machado's story?
Yes, it's her memoir of this relationship and also her early life experiences, her experiences in academia, and mixed in is a lot of kind of pop culture reference. There are bits of academic texts on lesbianism, sort of queer theory, and it's quite an exhilarating mix, actually. It reminded me a bit of, did you ever read A Visit from the GOON Squad by Jennifer Egan?
No, I haven't.
We did that for book club, and that's a shame if you haven't read that. I recommend it, actually, but there's a PowerPoint chapter in there that I remember just completely blew everyone's minds when we read it. But this book has something of that about it, and it's similarly brilliant. It's got a kind of choose your own adventure section in the middle. So you never get bored because it is endlessly inventive. And this story it's telling is a really powerful story. You know, the hook is you're wondering the whole time when she's going to get the strength and the inner conviction to leave this abusive relationship. I don't want to say too much more about it, actually, because I would hate to spoil it for anyone, but it has definitely been one of the most singular reading experiences I've had for a long time. I absolutely loved it.
Oh, it sounds really good.
I think it would be so good for book club as well, because it's not a long read, but there's just so many layers to it. There's so much kind of nuance. And it's just so interesting as well. Like, you know, just as a learning experience, I hadn't really considered the idea of lesbian relationships as being like this sense that, I suppose there's that negativity, isn't there, that comes with the idea of male abuse of women. And so lesbian relationships are somehow seen as like a safe haven from that. Like nothing could possibly go wrong between two women. But in fact, these abusive relationships do exist. But then it seems that within the community, there's a real stigma against speaking out about those relationships and telling your story if that's happened to you, which was all completely eye-opening to me. I didn't have any idea about any of that, and I just found it really fascinating, and I loved reading this. I absolutely loved it. It was brilliant.
It sounds like a great book club book. I'd like to read that. That sounds great.
Yeah, really good. You can borrow mine.
Oh,
the only thing that put me off slightly, actually, is the cover, which I really don't like. It's a kind of fragmented image of a house with like a black and white photo of a woman's body underneath. Her first collection was, I think, short stories, which someone I was chatting to also says is brilliant, so I really want to read that now. This cover is very much following on in the style of that, but I didn't really like that one much either. So, but on the other hand, she has got a bit of a neon thing going, which I like. Always very drawn to neon. So yeah, anyway, really happy discovery for me.
a bit of a tangent, but it's interesting because simply from the titles of your books, I'm guessing that they're all contemporary novels, published in the last year or two. Is that true?
Well, yeah, they're actually all non-fiction, but yes.
Oh, are they? Huh. Interesting. Only because I feel like our reading habits have really diverged over the lockdown period. It feels like a real jump to go from The Dream House to West with the Night, for example, or even A Drop of Patience.
Well, I'm going to listen to you make that segue, Laura. Off you
go. Have you read West with the Night by Beryl Markham?
Do you know what? I think I have, but I can't remember it. It's good, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I read it and I felt like a teenager. You know when you're young and you read books and they kind of imprint on you? I just felt like a little kid when I was reading it. I was like, how have I never read this? And basically, I want to be Beryl Markham. That's the gist of it. That was my key takeaway from this book. For those who don't know, she was an aviatrix. So she was a female pilot living in British East Africa in the 1930s. And she actually moved to British East Africa, what is now Kenya, when she was 4 with her father. And she grew up in a kind of mud shack as he was setting up a farm. And she had a very close relationship with the Nandi chieftain, one of the tribes near her farm, and she just ran wild. She was taken hunting. I don't think her father ever paid much attention to her. It was a really loving relationship, but, no oversight at all. And so this memoir of hers is all about that childhood, and then it's about her flying career, and the final chapter is about her flight. She was the first individual, man or woman, to ever fly across the Atlantic from east to west. So she took off from England and then crash landed in Nova Scotia. And that final chapter is incredibly gripping.
I don't think I have read this. I would remember this, wouldn't I, if I'd read it?
I think you would.
I think I'm thinking
I think
something
you
else.
would. It is so wonderful. It's the only book she ever wrote.
Sounds amazing.
She wasn't a writer, but she's a beautiful writer. It's very, what's the word? Well, when you read books from the 1930s and they're quite flowery, quite lyrical, but it's so of the time that you just sink into it. And as long as you're kind of like in the right mood, it sweeps you up in the writing. And actually, why don't I read you a little bit so you have a sense? So this is early on. Africa is mystic. It is wild. It is a sweltering inferno. It is a photographer's paradise, a hunter's Valhalla, an escapist's utopia. It is what you will, and it withstands all interpretations. It is the last vestige of a dead world or the cradle of a shiny new one. To a lot of people, as to myself, it is just home. It is all these things, but one thing, it is never dull. From the time I arrived in British East Africa at the indifferent age of 4 and went through the barefoot stage of early youth hunting wild pig with the Nandi, later training racehorses for a living, and still later scouting Tanganyika and the waterless bush country between the Tana and Athi rivers by aeroplane for elephant, I remained so happily provincial I was unable to discuss the boredom of being alive with any intelligence until I had gone to London and lived there a year. And she says, boredom, like hookworm, is endemic.
That's great. Oh, I love the sound of this. It sounds brilliant.
Oh, it's so good. It's not entirely unproblematic. She was a white settler, but she never really stumbles into the worst cliches, I think, in writing about the continent. I mean, I say that, of course, I did just read a passage where she's talking about Africa. And I don't know if you've ever watched Trevor Noah stand up. Have you?
No.
Oh my God, he's so funny. In early days of my baby arriving in the world, I watched some of it to take my mind off of everything. He has this very, very funny bit where he talks about North Americans, well, probably, Europeans too, obsession with Africa, as one homogeneous place. And I think Beryl Markham does a little bit of that, certainly in the passage I read. But this is an incredibly beautiful travel memoir. And what's so interesting about it is she does not talk at all about her personal life. So you only know from the bio that she was married 3 times, that she had a child, that she spent quite a lot of time in the UK. This memoir is just 100% about her adventures, really. And that's so refreshing. I think that's one of the reasons why I wish I had read it as a teenager, because she was just so singular. And actually, she reminded me a little bit of Peter Matthiessen, who wrote The Snow Leopard. another book I loved, although that one I would say is more problematic. But you know, one of these people who just did exactly what they wanted to do. There was nothing that was going to hold them back. Like, surely it was difficult to be a female pilot in the 1930s in British East Africa, but she just did what she wanted to do. At 17, her father basically went bankrupt after a really long drought, and he moved to South America. She stayed and set herself up as a horse trainer. I love this book. I would read it again. I was rereading it a little bit just last night to refresh my memory because it was a few weeks since I finished it. And I thought, I could just read the start to finish again. I've recommended it to a few people. They're like, I loved it. It's so good. I do think it would be a really good book club book as well because she's such an unusual woman. She's such an unusual role model. A fantastic book. You would love it. You should take it on your holiday this summer.
Well, the reason I know about it is because Emily Rhodes of Emily's Walking Book Club on Hampstead Heath, when I interviewed her, that was actually the book I think she started off with because people kept coming into Daunt Books where she worked and asking for it. And after a while, she started to think, what is it about this book? Why does everyone keep asking for West with the Night? And then she read it and found out that it was brilliant. So yeah, yes, that's well overdue. I think I'm thinking of Out of Africa. Have you ever read
by
that?
Karen Blixen.
Which I loved. I absolutely loved. But I think I'm sort of vaguely muddling them up.
I think there is a lot of overlap in many ways. There's an introduction to my edition, which is probably like a 1980s Virago edition by Martha Gellhorn, who was a writer in her own right, I believe.
She was a war correspondent, wasn't she?
Oh, was she? See, this is it, because I feel badly because I know the name from Mrs. Hemingway, that novel, and she was one of his 4 wives, wasn't she?
Ah.
But I'm glad you know her as a war correspondent.
Well, do I? Maybe my hand is inching towards Google.
That does ring bells. And she introduces this book and talks about the overlap between the two stories, except that Karen Blixen's was all about farming, whereas Beryl Markham's about pioneering big game hunting, which now you read about it and you're like, oh God, I can't believe they did that. But I guess, well, it was just another time.
Martha Ellis Gellhorn, American novelist, travel writer and journalist who is considered one of the great war correspondents, oh thank God, of the 20th century. She reported on virtually every major world conflict that took place during her 60-year career. And she was married to Ernest Hemingway.
That's so embarrassing that I know that. I should probably read some books by her. I bet you I'd love them.
Well, let me drag you back to contemporary non-fiction. Very different book, Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, who is a writer I was vaguely familiar with from The New Yorker. I think I sort of read a few of her articles. I love the title of this book. It really caught my attention. And it is a memoir of her time working in Silicon Valley. And she always was kind of an outsider to the tech world. She comes from a New York literary publishing background. She was an editorial assistant at old school literary publishers. Got really frustrated with just how badly paid it was. And her way in was there was a company who were basically trying to kind of come up with a great algorithm that would appeal to people who like reading. You know, it was a sort of book startup. And she got drawn in that way. She didn't end up working for them, but then she did interview for a job working for another company based in Silicon Valley, which she then got. So she moves there and she takes up this job at a data analytics startup. And she works in customer support. So in the kind of hierarchy of these companies, she's on the lowest rung. And she's not on the tech side. And it's quite funny the way that she has to scramble to really just learn anything about the tech side at all, because she really doesn't know it or understand it particularly. But she's able to learn what she needs to know to answer these customer queries. And from then on, she obviously then does acquire a certain amount of expertise. The blurb describes it as a coming-of-age story set against the backdrop of our generation's very own gold rush. It's a story about the tension between old and new, between art and tech, between the quest for money and the quest for meaning, about how our world is changing forever. So on the one level, it's her story, her experiences, meeting a new boyfriend, finding a flat, like, you know, sort of basic day-to-day personal stuff. But then also she's very interested in the kind of bigger picture of these companies and their growth and the way that they're changing society and changing culture. And she's observing that happening around her and musing on it while at the same time being deeply enmeshed in it, as we all are. I think that's kind of her point. One kind of almost like tick that the book has is that the companies are never referred to by name. So Airbnb is the home sharing platform. Google is a search engine giant down in Mountain View.
And does she explain why?
Well, I think it's because this book is kind of a time capsule. And I think she knew it would date. And I think by not tying it too specifically to things, plus also then possibly avoiding any legal implications with the things that she then says about these companies, it helps it transcend this very specific moment that she's in. But at the same time, that is what it's documenting. It's documenting a very specific moment, a very specific time. So all I can say is, if it annoys you, then at the end of the book, you can close the covers and you can go on Google and you can key in Anna Wiener, Uncanny Valley company names. And you will very quickly find there are people who've just listed exhaustively who all these companies are, like a kind of glossary. You know, when she says this, she means this. And you read that, and then, like me, you'll just be satisfied and you can move on. But yeah, it was
Is it
funny.
good? Did you enjoy it?
Well, it was such a funny read. I did enjoy it. I found it strangely unsatisfying. For me, it's kind of summed up by, on the cover, there's a quote from Rebecca Solnit. It says, "Joan Didion at a startup." Now, I don't know if you've read any Joan Didion. I'm no expert on her, but I have read a couple of things, and her writing is amazing. She had this kind of extraordinary ability to somehow get to the heart of things. And I think that's what Anna Wiener doesn't manage to do. She gives you all this information, you get all this data in quite a kind of relentless stream, but you don't really get any kind of payoff at the end. I remember saying to my husband as I was reading, I said, I just don't know where she's going with this. And it doesn't really go anywhere. But in the individual paragraphs, there are really interesting observations that I think she picks out really well. She's very good, I thought, on consumer culture. The direct-to-consumer companies sold cotton T-shirts, toothbrushes, rubber trees, rash cream, skin cream, leather bags, meal replacements, luggage, linen, contact lenses, cookies, hair dye, athleisure, wristwatches, vitamins. On any given night in America, exhausted parents and New Year's resolution cooks were unpacking identical cardboard boxes shipped by meal prep startups, disposing of identical piles of plastic packaging, and sitting down to identical dinners. Homogeneity was a small price to pay for the erasure of decision fatigue. It liberated our minds to pursue other endeavours, like work. So sometimes she could be so sharp, and I thought that was brilliant. So I did like this, and I do think it will be a really interesting read for book club, because it's the sort of book where you do want to pick it apart and discuss the things that are in it at the end. And yet, maybe much like browsing for books on Amazon, it sort of slightly leaves you with a, I don't know, like a strangely unsatisfying experience. And a shame, I think.
A bit of a so what?
Because it promised
So
much.
what?
Yeah. The only other thing as well was there's a sort of vague hook about the idea of sexism within the industry, but there wasn't really any significant sexism, I thought. There was, you know, the basic general omnipresent sexism that you get everywhere within every industry. I mean, publishing is a crazy industry for all the men doing all the powerful jobs at the top and, you know, women being paid lower. And I mean, it's just outrageous. I didn't see that Silicon Valley was any better or any worse. It just was the same, really. And so that presented as one aspect of this story, but to me it didn't seem particularly relevant. It wasn't specific to Silicon Valley, this sexist culture. I think it's more interesting the idea that the world is gradually being run by young white American males in, you know, comfortable sweatshirts and yeah, exactly, chinos.
No, they're probably not wearing chinos, actually. Expensive jeans.
Exactly. But again, she doesn't really do anything with that observation. You know, you sort of get it, but it doesn't really go anywhere. So I don't know. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, a really interesting book from a really interesting writer. It just didn't quite come off for me. But I do think it would be an interesting pick for book club.
Better than Bad Blood?
No, not nearly as good as Bad Blood. Because Bad Blood has this hugely charismatic central figure, doesn't it? It's a human interest story. And this is almost the opposite of that. It's an absence of human interest story. It's a story about something where people are just part of a giant machine and they're serving the algorithms. Her job as a customer service employee is, sure, she's speaking to humans, but everyone's just trying to achieve the same technical resolution. It reminded me of a novel I read a long time ago by Joshua Ferris called Then We Came to the End, which I loved, and it's set in an office, and it's written in this we voice. That's first person plural, is it? We did this, and then we thought this, and then something happened to this person, and we responded. It's like that. The whole novel is written like that. And it introduces this distance there. You don't have a single protagonist that you can identify with, and there's something of the same quality in Anna Wiener's memoir. it's not about one person, it's about the machine, it's about the culture.
It's interesting because I think the best nonfiction of this type, I think you have to focus on individuals. You have to find the individual stories to then weave together a bigger picture. Obviously, I'm thinking of Michael Lewis, who finds real people and he then weaves their story into a larger story. And it sounds like maybe that didn't quite come off here.
No, it was a good attempt, and there was a lot of interest in it.
Listeners, just a flag, we were talking about Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, and we discussed that on episode 55.
Tell me about... What else are we going to talk about?
Another terrible segue.
Oh, tell me about William Melvin Kelley.
Well, William Melvin Kelley. Now, you have read William Melvin Kelley. You read his first book, as did my book club, and we discussed it on episode 41.
Is that A Different Drummer?
Yeah, A Different Drummer. And on the front of that, it says, "The Lost Giant of American Literature," a quote from The New Yorker. So William Melvin Kelley died a few years ago now, in the past decade. He wrote A Different Drummer when he was 24, and then a few years later he wrote A Drop of Patience. And they were reasonably well received at the time, but then kind of just completely fell out of, I don't know, popular consciousness, of literary consciousness. And it was only after his death that people began to write about him again, and then the publisher River Run re-released this beautiful edition of A Different Drummer. And in a thrilling moment for me, the PR person for River Run got in touch after we talked about A Different Drummer and said, "Would you like to have A Drop of Patience?" And I said, "Yeah."
How great. I didn't know that. How cool.
But then I didn't do my bit because I received it about a year ago and hadn't picked it up. But I was looking at my shelves and I was like, gosh, what am I going to read? I need to read something other than book club books. I started it and I loved it. I think I loved it even more than A Different Drummer. Just to compare them for listeners, A Different Drummer is told from the perspective of the white people in a southern town, and it's June 1957, and a local black man, Tucker Caliban, has burned down his home. He's shot his horse, he's shot his cow, and he's picked up, taken his family, and left this unnamed state. And thereafter, the entire African American population leaves with him. So then there's this mass exodus. They've just left. They've had enough. And the story is told from the white people who are left behind, many of whom like to think that they were friends to, for example, Tucker Caliban, who thought that they were quite sympathetic to the circumstances of the black population. It's not a satire. It's told in a very realistic way, although, of course, it's speculative. I loved it. My book club loved it. You were a bit more critical. I do wonder if you might like A Drop of Patience more, because it is a much more straightforward story. It's about Ludlow, Washington, and you know what? The back cover is going to tell the synopsis better than me. At the age of 5, a blind African-American boy is handed over to a brutal state home. Here, Ludlow, Washington will suffer for 11 years until his prodigious musical talent provides him an unlikely ticket back into the world. The property of a band, playing for down and outs in a southern dive, Ludlow's pioneering flair will take him to New York and the very top of the jazz scene, where his personal demons will threaten to drag him back down to the bottom. It sounds really sad. I think that's why I didn't want to read it. And it is quietly devastating in moments. But William Melvin Kelley writes, I think, in that, I mean, it's actually the opposite of Beryl Markham, in that very incredibly pared back style you get from, I think, a lot of American novelists. And it's so easy to read and so subtle, I think, in its treatment of heartbreak. It doesn't dwell on it. It's just light touches to let you know how traumatized, for example, this young boy was at being left in the home. And we skip between key stages of his life every 30, 40 pages. So you zip along quite quickly. It's a really easy read. It's very beautiful. And of course, as I just said, Ludlow is blind. And what Kelley does is he tells the story of his life from the perspective of a blind man. And so the emphasis is never on what can be seen. It's always on sound and scent. And you really inhabit that world with Ludlow, Washington. And I never actually read anything like that. Have you ever read anything from the perspective of a blind character?
That sounds brilliant.
Yeah, it's really well done. And the observations of race, as you might imagine, are searing. And at this particular moment in history, it's even more important to read stories like this. If you like jazz, it would be a great book too, because he is one of the founding fathers of jazz. You know, he's experimenting with what music could be, should be. And he's doing this in a completely uncalculating way. He's just following the music. And there's a few passages where jazz as art is discussed, and Ludlow Washington is not interested in that discussion. He doesn't quite know what jazz means to him. He hasn't intellectualized it. It is just a part of him. So I found that really fascinating as well. It's great. It's so good. It's a real page turner.
Great. Oh, we're doing well this episode.
We are, aren't we? Sometimes we come on here and whinge about the books we've read. No,
Well,
never whinge.
I've got one more quick one, which is just a little aside. It's a book called Morning by Allan Jenkins. So lockdown for me has been a real shift in my diurnal rhythms because in order to evade my children, I've had to get up very early in order to carve out some time to get some stuff done. And that does not come naturally to me. I am definitely an owl rather than a lark. But yeah, I've been getting up at 6 and then realised that wasn't really early enough. So sometimes I
think
get up
that's
at
so
5.
impressive. I don't know how you're doing it.
It's not, yeah, I'm very tired. And I think I was just almost reaching out for a bit of consolation, and I came across this book. It was mentioned on Claire Hanscom's show, Britlit. One of her interviewees flagged it up, and it just caught my attention because of this whole early rising thing that I'm finding a bit of a struggle. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll get some kind of sense of solidarity if I read about other people who are getting up really early. So it's a memoir. Allan Jenkins is the editor of the Observer Food Monthly, the very successful Observer newspaper's supplement, and he had previous success, I think, with a book that I was vaguely aware of about an allotment. It's called Plot 29. I don't know anything about that, but I just had some sense that had done quite well. And so this book is his manifesto for morning, he says. There's an energy in the earlier hours, an awareness I enjoy. In today's world, we tend to wake as late as we can, time to when we have to work, but we don't need to chase the day. So he shows how getting up earlier gives us this very special time in the day. It's his own diary of his early mornings, and then interspersed with that are interviews with people who are consistently early risers. Jamie Oliver, slightly surprisingly, turns out to be one. I don't know why, just because he's so famous. Turns out he gets up early, which actually doesn't really surprise
successful
me.
people get up early.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And I think there's definitely something to be said for this idea of, you're kind of stealing a march on the day. You're up and you're doing stuff when everyone else is asleep, and there's something extraordinarily satisfying about that. But then the trade-off is your evenings are just shot. I mean, just a write-off. There is a kind of calmness and a beauty to the early mornings. There's a stillness to it that, obviously everyone's got up early at some point in their life. We've all experienced it. There's something about when you do it consistently, it starts to become almost a bit of a drug, maybe a bit like that kind of high you get after exercise. You start to get a bit addicted to this very special atmosphere. And it's a very kind of creative time, I think, in lots of ways. I think for him, quite a spiritual time. He sort of lights incense and just stares out the window a lot of the time. You wouldn't think it was very interesting, but I found it very pleasing to read. It's sort of meditative, reflective. Almost, it's not like poetry, but it's got something of that quality of stillness about it that I really liked. So yeah, I recommend that. Not for book club, I don't think. It's not really something you can debate or pick apart. Although it might be a good companion read to Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, actually. If you wanted to put something else into the mix, if you were thinking about doing that one, this could be a good one to go with it. Funnily enough, having read the Matthew Walker, I was then very worried about Allan Jenkins because it didn't sound to me like he got nearly enough sleep. And as we know from Matthew Walker, that's not a good thing. Anyway, so that's been my another little kind of note to my lockdown reading.
One more aside, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. That was episode 38, listeners.
Yeah,
We're doing a lot of referencing back in time on this episode.
They're all so good.
My final book to discuss is The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. I took the leap. I bought it ages ago now, but it's so big, and I just thought, oh no. I mean, I loved the first books. Absolutely adored them.
Yeah,
Found
me
them
too.
page turners, but there's just the size of The Mirror and the Light. I thought, oh, no, I can't do it. And then I'm just flipping through the pages now. I got to part 1, and the first sentence is, once the queen's head is severed, he walks away. And I was like, what have I been doing? Why haven't I been reading this book? I mean, what an opening line.
That's so
And
good.
no one writes like Hilary Mantel. She's incredible.
There was an excerpt from it in The Guardian, just probably like a bit of the first chapter or something, and I read that, and I was at that moment, I was like, oh my God, I have to read this. She's so good. But unlike you, I haven't yet made the leap.
Well, I made the leap, and I got about 500 pages in. Let's see exactly where did I get to. I got to 427, and I thought, I need a break. Just a little break. I just needed to read something else. So
I heard there were
I'm
a lot
going to
of
go back
lists.
to it now.
A lot of lists of things.
Lists?
Yeah, like lists of items. No?
I haven't reached any lists, or at least the
bothered you.
lists haven't jumped out at me.
Yeah, like kind of exhaustive lists of like weaving materials or,
No, I haven't got to that yet. found the first 300 or so pages are again about court intrigues, and I love the court intrigues. It's so Machiavellian. I still have never watched West Wing, but I wonder if it's a little bit like that. It's a page turner. You want to know who's up, who's down, what are the politics. They're all dancing around Henry VIII. It's great. And then there's a rebellion, of which I knew nothing in English history. And there I found it started to drag because the rebellion is in the north of England and Cromwell is in London. So it's all just at one remove. And that's when I thought, okay, I'm going to pause and go back to it. Really got to emotionally prepare myself for Cromwell's downfall. That's not giving anything away. I mean, that's
you know
just
it's coming,
history.
don't you? Must be a sense of, sort of creeping dread. I mean, you had that in the first 2 books.
And it's foreshadowed too, because the rebellion, he is the chief hate figure for the rebels. It's not Henry VIII, because they would never question the king's authority. I mean, that would be even more suicidal than the rebellion itself. But Cromwell, having been a common man, he is the scapegoat, I think, for everything bad that is happening in the nation. And they say he is controlling Henry VIII. So you can see how it's going to unravel for Cromwell, because Henry VIII isn't going to stand for it, I think. Although maybe there's more to it. I don't know the story enough. I just know that someone's going to lose their head.
As is often the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I must read that.
So happy reading in lockdown. We've done well.
Yeah, and I think all these would make good summer reads as well. Especially the Machado. You wouldn't think, but I promise you, just give it a try because it's amazing. Such a great book.
I really like the sound of it. I think I will.
Yeah, really good. That's all for this episode. We'll have another one coming soon. In the meantime, don't miss our most recent book club episode on The Beekeeper of Aleppo, a heartrending novel about Syrian refugees that we discussed with Anna Bailey-Carris of Australian podcast Books on the Go. And our episode on That Glimpse of Truth, the short story collection that's been getting Laura's book club through lockdown.
In the meantime, if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or you can email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate, review and subscribe to us. In this time of corona crisis, when people need good podcasts more than ever, it helps other listeners find us and means you'll never miss an episode.
But for now, stay safe, read some great books, and take care.